Hi, my name is Erin James, and I co-founded and co-direct the Confluence Lab with my colleagues Jen Ladino from the English department and Teresa Cohen from Natural Resources. We're all based at the University of Idaho. The Confluence Lab is based at the University of Idaho in Moscow, Idaho. We are a humanities-led interdisciplinary lab that investigates conceptual and communication barriers that underlie debates about controversial issues, especially relevant to rural communities, such as public land use, natural resource management, wildfires, drought, energy infrastructure, and the causes and effects of climate change. Our primary goal is to facilitate idea exchange, and our central premise is that the tools of the humanities, especially those related to storytelling, representation, emotions, and communication, can help develop holistic approaches to these issues from the ground up. So we hatched the idea for the lab in September of 2018. That month, Jen and I traveled to the Taft Nicholson Center for the Environmental Humanities, which is a branch campus of the University of Utah that's located in the Centennial Valley in southern Montana, which is part of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. It's a place of very interesting tension. The campus is located in an abandoned ghost town that the university benefactors had exhumed and restored some years earlier. It's a site so remote from mainstream American life that, a little worryingly, Grizzly Protocol meant that we always had to walk in pairs, but in which the closest neighbors, who are 8 miles down the road, are the powerful political activists, the Koch brothers. Inspired by the ways in which this retreat brought people together, Jen and I left the valley fired up to make things happen on our campus. And we drafted the initial plan for the Confluence Lab during the rather productive 9-hour car ride home. During that conversation, we kept coming back to the tension between narratives of wilderness and untouched nature and the realities of today's environmental crisis that dominated our experience in the Centennial Valley, a tension that we feel particularly strongly in rural communities such as ours. And this tension was a powerful reminder of the emotions and stories that determine our experience of an environment, yet can be otherwise left unacknowledged. So one premise of our lab that has stayed consistent from the start is that confronting environmental challenges, especially those in rural environments, requires an all hands on deck approach. Environmental problems are complicated, and we believe that they are not only scientific and economic, but equally ethical, political, historical, cultural, rhetorical, and emotional. And solutions must draw on all forms of these knowledge. So to aid this work, our lab is guided by 4 goals. Goal number 1 is to collaborate and to identify challenges to addressing environmental problems. So divisions that exacerbate environmental problems can take many forms, of course, whether perceived ideological and political polarization, or urban-rural divides, town-gown divides, or even disciplinary obstacles to obtaining grant funding or working on projects together. Climate change, for example, comes with a unique set of challenges. The fear and anxiety that accompany it can be overwhelming and paralyzing. One of our initial projects explores the hypotheses that many climate skeptics have heightened anxiety about climate change and use denial as a coping mechanism. Our lab focuses on identifying obstacles like these and on working creatively across barriers to bring diverse people to the table to work on projects from the ground up as equal partners. We see value in bringing scholars from social sciences and humanities to the table at the beginning stages of a project idea, rather than tapping them on later, often as writers or copy editors or packages of information. And as you'll see when my colleagues discuss some of our projects in more detail, a guiding philosophy of the lab is that personal stories about environmental change are an important data set that we should pay attention to. We repeat to ourselves often, stories are data. Goal number 2 is to foster fresh approaches to problems that are innovative and exclusive. So our second goal is to find new ways to approach environmental problems that reach beyond disciplinary silos and involve community members as equal partners. Humanities and social science scholars have important skills and knowledge to offer, understanding the human dimensions of environmental problems, fostering empathic conversation techniques, visualizing and narrating scientific data, creating new kinds of stories, art and music projects, videos, podcasts, and more. All of these are essential to conveying the urgency of environmental problems in ways that are engaging and not off-putting. Goal number 3 is to create occasions for dialogue, including performances, exhibits, readings, and symposia. And a key priority of the Confluence Lab is to create and maintain a calendar of events that brings people together to talk and share ideas. In our first year, these events included a series of working lunches. We met every 2 weeks for a year that brought together experts from a variety of disciplines to share ideas and generate new projects. We also hosted book club conversations on campus and in local libraries across the state that kickstarted discussions on climate change via climate change fiction. And we hosted the sharing of an in-progress musical composition called the Wilderness Suite, which Teresa will tell you about more in a moment. Our fourth goal is to execute outreach projects in the service of a healthier state. So we're thrilled to have 5 funded projects off the ground after just over a little over a year in operation. And now I'm going to hand over to Teresa and Jen, who are going to tell you more about these projects.
All right, I am Teresa Cohn, co-founder of the Confluence Lab and director of the University of Idaho's Taylor Wilderness Research Station. And I'd like to take a few minutes to describe one of the Confluence Lab's first projects, which is not just rural, but remote even by Idaho standards. The Big Creek Collaborative Rephotography Project focuses on 35 miles of the Big Creek drainage, deep in the heart of the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness, where the University of Idaho maintains the most remote wilderness research station in the lower 48. You can see it in that area in blue. This project originated as a simple repeat photography project designed to first examine both human and environmental change by locating historic photographs and retaking them as exactly as possible in order to compare change over time. So the image you see on the screen here is an image of an area that was homesteaded and ranched and actually was removed after wilderness designation. So that's something that we see in several of the photographs. The next image is an image, there we go, of fire landscape. So this area has seen a lot of increasing fire, and in this image you can see the historic photograph is forested, and then the more recent photograph doesn't have forests as a result of climate change and also fire management and fire suppression over the last several decades. And so then our first goal was to retake those photographs so that we could see comparisons of environmental change. A second objective was to interview stakeholders to understand the values they held about change. And then third, to quantify some of the identified changes using remote sensing techniques. Our objective is to better understand change and the ways in which change is perceived in an area of the American West that has become less influenced, not more influenced, by human activity over time. Through Confluence Lab collaborations, the project quickly grew. University of Idaho music professor Ruby Fulton composed a piece of music for the Icarus Quartet that not only conveys the extreme and rugged topographical variations of this area, but also the spoken word of interviewees as music itself. The composition embodies some of the central themes identified by interviewees, such as the strong aviation culture grandfathered into this wilderness, despite banned motorized use, the fact that many homesteads were burned to return this area to a more pristine and untrammeled state after wilderness designation, and the growing impact of wildfire. All of this is conveyed musically. Likewise, film and media studies professor Ben James joined the team and is currently creating a visual component to the project in which historic imagery is juxtaposed into present. His work asks us to consider the relationship of time to place, such as the imprint of historic legacies on living landscapes and duration of human influence in the context of both distant past and distant future. Together, the visual and audio compositions combine with remote sensing and rephotography techniques to explore this remote landscape of Idaho as a whole through science, narrative, emotion, storytelling, music, photography, and film. So with that, I'll turn things over to Jen.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jen Ladino, professor of English, and along with Teresa and Aaron, the other co-founder and co-director of the Confluence Lab. As you've no doubt gathered from what my colleagues have been saying, pragmatic outreach projects are a top priority for our lab. In Idaho, we are uniquely positioned to work with rural communities, which distinguishes us from some of the similar labs around the West, such as UCLA's Lens, and around the world, such as Stavanger's Greenhouse, where I was lucky to visit with Dolly Jorgensen and her colleagues last fall. Idaho is home to some of the largest wilderness areas in the US, as you were just seeing, and Idahoans are becoming increasingly concerned about climate change. If you look at the Yale Climate Opinions Maps, for example, about 54% of us in Idaho are worried about it, which is just 6% shy of the national average. As Catherine Hayhoe points out repeatedly, and others notice this as well, hardly anyone is talking about climate change. Only 36% of Idahoans discuss global warming at least occasionally. So with those things in mind, it's apt that our 5 funded projects so far focus on wilderness, as well as on climate change representation, skepticism, and communication. I'm going to go back to this slide for a moment because in addition to the Rephotography project, another early project for the lab is called Our Changing Climate, Finding Common Ground Through Climate Fiction. This is funded by the Idaho Humanities Council through 2 different grant schemes. And the project uses Barbara Kingsolver's novel, Flight Behavior, as a launchpad for talking with Idaho community members about how they're perceiving climate change in their hometowns. I've been working on this with PhD candidate and science education specialist Kayla Bordelon, who's one of Teresa's students and now one of mine as well. Kayla and I are both former National Park Service rangers, and we draw on NPS audience engagement strategies to invite participants to share their stories through face-to-face conversation. Erin mentioned how we treat stories as data, and the data we're gathering through these conversations has been really inspiring. Kayla and Teresa have also been involved with a climate change communication project called NASA Earth to Sky. The project brings together a regional community of practice to develop workshops for formal and informal educators, as well as climate communication initiatives that work with the Idaho public. As you can see, they had a lot of fun at their training last October. Another project that I've been really lucky to be involved with is an interdisciplinary research project led by 2 sociologists here at U of I. We're using survey and interview data to try to understand climate skepticism, as well as what factors contribute to people changing their minds about climate change. I'm working mostly on the emotional factors involved, but we're also investigating issues like gender, religious beliefs, and whether or not people have had negative firsthand experiences with natural disasters or bad air quality, for example. My colleagues have recently published about the pro-environmental views of climate skeptics, which is really interesting work. And currently we're working on additional articles as we finish coding the data. 2 more quick projects that are under submission right now. We've got an NSF grant, largely due to Teresa's good work, under review called Stories of Fire, which would gather firsthand personal narratives about wildland fire from rural Idahoans. Using narrative theory, Erin's area of expertise, and science communication research, we would ask what storytelling techniques most effectively integrate lived experience and accurate STEM content in fire science communication. We also want to find out what audience-centered approaches best facilitate narrative approaches to informal STEM learning. So we're hoping to hear about that grant anytime. We've also applied for an NEH collaborative research grant, which would bring together a team of scholars from around the West who work on things like wilderness history, art and design, philosophy, geography, anthropology, ecology, and literary studies to explore the value and functions of wilderness in the time of climate change. If we're funded, which is always a big if, it would involve a series of events in McCall and at the Taylor Wilderness Research Station, which here's a photo of. It's a beautiful place, as well as in Moscow, and it would have public-facing components at every stage. So that's where things stand with the Confluence Lab today. We're really excited to be part of this event and happy to answer any questions you might have for us or elaborate on any of these projects. Thanks so much to Bethany and the Penn Program in Environmental Humanities for inviting us to share our work with you today.